So let's finish talking about these cell communication. I think that was the last slide from our last deck of slides, by the way, so we're moving on over here. So these cell communication molecules, or ways that our cells communicate one to another, again with these surface receptors binding to ligands. We just looked at a couple of examples of surface receptors, these pattern recognition ones that can bind to foreign molecules, but now let's look at some other types of communication molecules that are elicited or secreted by our own cells. These are a whole group of molecules called cytokines, which are very small molecules that are involved in cell-to-cell communication. Cytokines are secreted in response to one particular stimuli or stimulus, and that secreted cytokine then binds to another cell, and the binding elicits a very particular response too. So cytokines are a very nice way for our cells to communicate what's going on, so what's the trigger, the stimulus, and also to elicit a very particular type of response. There are different types of cytokines. Cyto is cell, kine, I'm not sure, but we're talking about small molecules that have particular messages, essentially, that they are transmitting. The different classes of cytokines, chemokines, that's one that you probably should be aware of. Chemokines are chemotactic factors. Chemokines are chemotactic factors. Those are what we mentioned just a few minutes ago as those particular molecules that draw or attract white blood cells to the site of injured tissue. Chemokines are not just to recruit cells to injured tissue, though. They're also to recruit lymphocytes to, say, the lymph nodes, or to direct trafficking of our white blood cells inside our body. There are other types of cytokines like colony-stimulating factors, CSFs, interferons, interleukins, tumor necrosis factors. You don't have to remember all of those particular classes, but there are some that I would like for you to know as we work through some of this stuff. I've included a table from one of the previous versions of the textbook because I think it does a good job in talking about some of the general types of these particular cytokines. Again, chemokines are chemotactic factors, as we just said. They can be secreted by a whole bunch of different types of cells. Almost any cell that has, almost any cell can secrete a chemokine. So injured tissue can secrete chemokines, and white blood cells can secrete them, etc. Colony-stimulating factor, we actually are not going to talk about this one at all. These are really important in stimulating the growth of different types of leukocytes that are needed for a particular response, but we won't be discussing these in detail. Interferons are secreted by mostly white blood cells, but some can be other basic cells that can be infected with viruses or T-cell lymphocytes. We're going to focus on this one in particular, interferon gamma, sorry. This is an antiviral. All of our interferons are antiviral trigger molecules, so we'll look at this one in particular at the end of this set of slides. You don't need to know the names of all of these different guys. For interleukins, this is an enormous class of molecules. There's a whole bunch of them. They're listed interleukin 1 through et cetera, et cetera. We're going to look at some when we get into our next chapter on the T and B cell response, and we'll talk about which ones are involved in triggering very particular types of responses. Interleukins are almost exclusively secreted by our lymphocytes, but some can be, like interleukin 1, as part of our pro-inflammatory cytokine response and can be secreted by macrophages and epithelial cells. And you can see some of the effects of these cytokines over here. And the last category, tumor necrosis factor. This is actually a very short list of the cytokines that our body has circulating in that serum, but some of the most important ones that we'll talk about are things like tumor necrosis factor alpha. This is one that if it is secreted in the whole body system, this is what causes like toxic shock syndrome or death by sepsis. It's not usually the bacteria itself, but it's usually the immune cell response, specifically TNF-alpha, that's secreted, and it can cause massive inflammatory response throughout the entire body and cause significant damage. But if it's secreted locally, it has a very profound effect on a localized inflammatory response. Again, we don't need to know all of these, but as we talk through them, you'll have heard them once, and then as I bring them up, they'll hopefully be familiar. So